story begins in 1989 at the Funabashi port, a popular street racing area in the greater area of Tokyo. Near the center of it all is Akira Nakai, key member of the racing team Rauh World. Today, the world knows him as Nakai-san, but in 1989 he was simply a street racer. Every night, right after dinner, Nakai-san drove his car to the race area, which was only 30 minutes away. Funabashi was a bustling proving ground, busy with anticipation and the nerves of 20-year-olds eager to prove themselves. The drivers would race at dangerous speeds to test their cars and their skills near the limit. When they needed a break, they would stop by the parking areas to rest. Nakai and his team would park under the spotlight to hang out with more quote-unquote mature racers. Those who were there say that he carried a certain aura about him, changing the atmosphere of the scene at his arrival. At the time, he was around 21 years old and a few years into his driving license. Now, while he wanted a Porsche 911, like most racers of the time, he used an A86 as a stepping stone. He became one of the best racers there, known for his unique and reckless driving style. It was in these street racing days where Nakai-san slowly developed the philosophy of what would become RWB, Rauh, Welt, bespoke. In the 90s, the racing moved from Funabashi to the Tsukuba touge and Hakone, where the racers would battle more seriously. They gathered on Saturday and raced until the sun rose on Sunday. Smaller public roads and the touge became equalizers that pitched drivers against each other. While a powerful car could outgun a lower class vehicle on a high speed course, powerful cars have to brake a lot more on smaller roads, losing a lot of speed that they gain in the straights. Thanks to this factor, the A86 could keep up with more powerful cars on the smaller roads, and this allowed Nakai-san to win battles and build a reputation. In 1997, he flexed his skill when he entered a drift competition and made his first media appearance. Nakai-san captured the attention of Carboy magazine and perhaps the rest of Japan by drifting a cream-colored A86 in the 1997 Doricon GP. While many street racers at the time raced with the aim of becoming professional drivers, Nakai-san's philosophy was different. His driving was showy, bold, and spectacular, and he preferred to focus on flair rather than outright speed. So instead of wanting to be known as a good driver, he wanted to be known as a passionate one. To complement his driving style, Nakai also presented a unique way of modifying his car, with unique paint, fenders, visible bolts, tires to keep the bumpers in place, and exaggerated camber. His style was partly inspired by the Lancia Stratos. Now, while these don't sound or look like new ideas today, in 1997 this was not the norm. There were several styles for drift cars at the time, and many of them aimed to be colourful or stylish, whether the cars had a lot of money put into them or looked relatively stock. For a lot of drift cars, damage from driving practice was played off as a joke, but Nakai-san had his own style entirely. In Rauh World, the scuffs and scratches of driving were embraced as part of the aesthetic without being too on the nose. The cars looked roughed or industrial, and that was their style. Nakai-san talked about his thoughts on modifying cars in a Carboy article that he was featured in. He talked about the coolness of being unpolished and how flaws could add character to both a person and a car. That was the philosophy of Rauh World, whether it was on an A86 or a Porsche. Nakai-san's fashion, dress sense, and surroundings seemed to portray a bad boy persona, but his demeanor suggested otherwise. Outside of the car, his attitude was polite, simple, and based. It seemed then that the elevated style of Rauh World could be even more emphasized by how legit it was. The look and the style of his cars were as a result of practicality and the wear of driving. He only had one Porsche at the time, a 356 Speedster, and it wasn't even a real Porsche since it was only a replica. However, the following year, Carboy magazine would interview him again, and this time he had a real Porsche 911. It's a well-known story that a 911 rolled into his workshop for repairs, becoming the turning point for Nakai-san. He repaired the car and had his own 911 shortly after, a narrow-body 930. In 1998, Carboy interviewed him again, where he demonstrated his 911 build. While it might have been a surprise that Nakai-san wasn't with an A86, for him, it was inevitable. There was no turning back. It was the car that he had always wanted, and now he had it. Nakai modified his 911, imprinting his identity, vibe, and essence throughout the car. He applied the same philosophy to the Porsche that he did with the A86. Bumper ties, matte paint, rivets, and built for high-speed driving. The car also had black headlight casings, side step removal, a wing, and was lowered with camber. The idea was to drive it, repair it, and modify it, letting the car develop character, in the same way that you would with an A86. There was no goal, competition, or spec that this car was built for. It wasn't made for a drift competition, or drag race, or time attack. The goal really was to have an all-round, very good driver's car. For the mechanicals, the car had Corvair bucket seats, Weber carbs and SPL suspension, with the aim that it should be able to drift at 200 km per hour. For the wheels, Nakai picked out 15-inch SSR mesh wheels that were painted black. At the time, you had Japanese cars which were being driven and tuned one way with off-the-shelf parts, and the Porsche 911s, which were owned by a completely different demographic. Luxury car owners were more like purists than street racers, and Porsche 911s in Japan, up until that point, were mostly built in a rigidly formulaic way, such as the roof cars, or the way that Singer or Gunther would build 911s today. Nakai didn't belong to either crowd. He took the Japanese grassroots culture of modifying cars, bought Japanese aftermarket parts off the shelf, followed the rough world way of modifying them, mixed it with a style heavily influenced by the American hot rod car movies that he grew up watching, and applied it to a purely German car. The result was a Porsche that looked and drove completely different to many 911s. This car and its owner captured a sensible amount of intrigue, and Nakai-san started to achieve a low-key cult status, with a number of Rauh Welt Porsches starting to appear around, mainly owned by friends and a lot of people he knew. However, according to Nakai, the aim of popularity was never a consideration when building cars. Nakai also declared that from now on, Rauh World was to become Rauh Welt, which was essentially the same thing but in German. The name change represented the manifestation of his idea's metamorphosis from an AE86 drift team to now an exclusive Porsche retrofitter. He kept building cars and the style evolved until 2002. In 2002, the Porsche had left some of the hot rod style and became far more focused on racetrack performance. It was now painted in gloss red with clips instead of zip ties to hold the bumpers in place. The car received new bumpers, kit and a wing too, with stickers, glass replacements, suspension, Permadet carbs, a series brake kit, and black SSR 5-spoke wheels. Most importantly, some of the signature style remained, or it took a new place in the form of what would eventually be the signature RWB Overfenders. Nakai-san had them made by workshop and bolted them onto the car to lower it as much as possible. He also did this to make room for bigger tires. The car was low enough that he couldn't fit 2 fingers between the tires and the arches of the new fenders. To keep the tires from hitting the guards, the spring rates were adjusted. When he took the car to the racetrack, Nakai recalls that people looked on in shock, possibly thinking that the car was completely insane to be modified in such a way, especially being a Porsche. Even the AE86 owners who leaned towards the crazy side of car building were a bit bewildered. The car was heavily modified, a complete rebuild, and not in the same way that Rauh or even Gambala would build a car. It was a Japanese, time attack, Rauh Welt, hot rod, Porsche 911. In any case, it was extremely fast, faster than many track Porsches from Stuttgart, and it was able to overtake traffic easily. It was as fast as it looked, and Nakai had no complaints. With time, people began to take a liking to the car, or at least the vibe of people's responses seemed to change. From this point, it was only onwards for RWB. It can be said that this red car is an early prototype, or the earliest foundation of what RWB would become. In the mid to late 2000s, there was the internet. Journalists wrote about the Rauh Welt's workshop and the type of cars that RWB was churning out for their customers, and this propelled Nakai-san to a level of international stardom that he hadn't seen before. By then, his Porsche would receive even more modification, noticeably new fenders, matte black paint, wing, gold accents, a new kit, and even more of the ground clearance gone, as well as gold SSR wheels with RWB branding. There was also the name, Stella Artois, as in the beer from Belgium. The name thing would eventually become a tradition for all the cars Nakai would build. At this point, the car world was starting to know who he was, and there was no turning back. In 2011, RWB had their first international customer. It was in the wake of the terrible earthquake, and Japan was locked down due to radiation. However, a wealthy client travelled from overseas to meet Nakai-san and have his car made, despite the danger. Nakai-san respected his balls, and this opened up RWB to the world. The rest, could be said, is history. What does RWB mean? RWB stands for Rauh Welt Begriff, or Rough World Concept. In essence, rough represents Nakai-san's view on cars, his style and the way he builds them. The origins of the word rough being from the late 80s and early 90s, and the style with which he built AE86s. World, at least today, represents the idea that people around the world might think the same way and have the same taste in similar cars, even though they're from different places and cultures. Or as Nakai puts it, same mind. Put those together and you have the idea of Nakai-san's Porsches being as cool as they are everywhere in the world,